You're listening to All Kinds of Catholic with me, Teresa Alessandro. My conversations with different Catholics will give you glimpses into some of the ways we're living our faith today. Pope Francis has used the image of a caravan, a diverse group of people travelling together on a sometimes chaotic journey together. That's an image that has helped to shape this podcast. I hope you'll feel encouraged and affirmed, and maybe challenged at times. I am too in these conversations. So listeners, I'm looking forward to today's conversation. I'm being joined by Nigel. Hello, Nigel.
Hello, Teresa.
And I think there's going to be lots of really interesting material to have a little talk about today. So why don't we start, Nigel, with your childhood, as I often do. Were you born into a Catholic family?
Well, yes, I was. I was born in Essex to a Catholic mother and an Anglican father. In those days, that's the 1950s. In the normal way, my father agreed that any children would be brought up as Catholic, and that's what happened. Went to Catholic schools. I'm told that my mother used to take us children to Mass. And one day when I was maybe 3 or 4, I refused to go to Mass because Dad didn't come with us. And when my mother told him that, he said, well, I'd better come then. And I think he came from that day on for the rest of his life. So he came to Mass with us, but he didn't become a Catholic until, in fact, the age of 80. It's an interesting thing how that came about, because we were very used to the idea that Mum is Catholic and Dad is Anglican. And it became a sort of a bit of a family joke in a way. We said Dad would only become Catholic if they let him be Pope. We kind of made a joke of it. And one day we did that at the dinner table, and he said, with a bit of seriousness, he said, you know what, none of you have ever really asked me to be Catholic. That gave me some pause. And I thought, well, he's right. It would be too embarrassing, too personal in a way, to ask him seriously and directly. But that set me on a train of thinking, and I did encourage him. I gave him some things to read, and I think a rosary. Well, then a priest came to the parish who also took an interest in him in that respect. It was still quite difficult. He was 78, 79 at that point, but he'd been Anglican all his life. He felt, in a sense, when I asked him about it, there were a few issues he was not a little bit uncomfortable about with the church, but he also felt a sense of betrayal, I think. He'd been baptized, confirmed as an Anglican, and that worried him a little bit. Anyhow, I tried to deal with all those issues. And in the end, I wrote him a letter. It was too difficult to say it all face to face. Tried to answer his concerns. Ultimately, that led to him going to see the parish priest. He didn't really have much time for formal instruction because the priest was about to retire, and he wasn't very keen on doing the RCIA. So I'm sorry to tell you that the only formal instruction he had, apart from coming to Mass for 50 years, was 2 questions from the parish priest. Do you believe what it says in the creed? And do you accept the Pope as the head of the church? And my father said yes to those 2 questions, and he was received the following Sunday. That's not a perfect model of being received into the church, is it? But that is actually what happens. And for the remaining 16 years of his life, he died in August last year, he was very happy as a Catholic. My mother was astonished. She couldn't believe that after, 50 years of marriage, he had finally become a Catholic. And then he got, as I thought he would, he got quite keen on it. He threw himself into everything that he did. So sure enough, when he became a Catholic, he'd read in the bulletin, Stations of the Cross. He said, well, should we go to that? Or whatever they were, let's go to that. He liked to go to things and play a full part in whatever he joined. So very much valued having become a Catholic. And I was very pleased that he was able to receive the last rites of the church about a week before he died.
I just let you tell that whole story, Nigel, because it's just so amazing. I'm glad that you've come from a background where one parent was Anglican and one parent was Catholic, because I don't think we've had that before amongst our guests. People have either come from a family where both parents were Catholic, or they've become a Catholic later in life. So that's a little first, a very common situation actually, but a little first for podcast listeners. So I'm really glad about that. But then this amazing journey for your father over all those years becoming a Catholic. You've packed in there so much of your own support for him in the ways that you were able to, that I think will really resonate with listeners. Thank you for sharing all of that.
You're welcome.
I'm astounded how quickly you've brought out such an amazing story there from your own experience.
Thank you. I'll just add a couple of things to that. One is that, yes, he wasn't, really interested in theology or academic kind of argument. But two things, I think two people he was impressed by were Cardinal Hume and Pope John Paul II. And I think he felt they were both men of great integrity and spirituality. And I think that also had played its part in leading him to the idea of being Catholic.
Oh, that's interesting. Let's just see if we can unpick that a little bit. What was it that spoke to him of integrity?
Well, I think, to be honest, the Catholic Church tends to be a bit clearer about its doctrine than, let's say, the Church of England. And perhaps what I'm really saying is he was less impressed by some of the leadership in the Church of England, which does change a bit and is a bit less definite about some of its teaching. So I think that was probably what it was, as a consistency. And I think with Cardinal Hume especially, there's a sense of a man of great spirituality, which is evident to see. I think he admired people who were clear about what they believed and what they taught and kept to it.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And then if we may return to you, Nigel. So you said you went to Catholic schools, and then I'm going to skip on a little bit. Well, we might just ask, actually, while you were at school, was your faith, was it something you were aware of, being a Catholic, or was it just sort of the sea you swam in? Was your faith important to you?
I think it was, actually. This is a pretty vague recollection, but I do remember my confirmation. I have a feeling that I thought to myself, I think I just will believe this somehow. There was some sort of either will or decision or sense that, yes, I will believe this and I will continue to believe it and I won't give it up. In a way, I think that has stayed the same. I won't say there have been some incidents along the way, but generally, I think I've had this sense that it's right and it's true, even if it's a bit inconvenient sometimes. So I didn't have great crises of doubt and so on. And I think I quite happily went to a Catholic secondary school. They had mass in the chapel every morning, Jesuit Foundation School in Hornchurch. And I used to go to mass, now and again on weekday mornings. We had weekly mass of the whole school, benediction every Friday afternoon. Sometimes the teacher would come in and make the sign of the cross. You say the Hail Mary before a class. So Catholicism was woven into the school. All the others were Catholic. It was easy, if you like, to be Catholic. I don't think we all talked about it a great deal. We had discussions, I suppose, in the later years. What's interesting is this is the 70s. Religious knowledge classes, RE, was hardly taught in the sort of way that it might be taught according to a syllabus. Most of the classes were kind of discussion sessions. What's on the mind of the fourth form today, the chaplain would say. I don't think there was even an option of doing a religious knowledge O-level. So on the one hand, that's rather bad, isn't it? So I didn't really have a systematic appreciation of Catholic theology. On the other hand, it was sort of good because what I discovered about it, I discovered for myself. I remember discovering my mother's and indeed my grandmother's prayer book in a drawer at home from the 1930s, 1940s, all these amazing prayers and indulgences and a whole treasury, let's say, of Catholicism, which I hadn't really come across before. I wasn't taught it. I don't think I was even taught the Angelus, for example. So I kind of felt I discovered that for myself, and therefore it wasn't being, thrust down my throat. And at home, we didn't have, as people sometimes tell you, the family rosary every night at 7:00. My family was never like that. So I didn't feel pressure from home or from school to be a great devout Catholic. But I found myself interested in what I discovered, and it was my own journey. And I guess I enjoyed the autonomy of that. Without that pressure, I think I then got more interested in going a bit more deeply into things.
I can hear that. That's really interesting. Having grown up in an environment where you were, looking at your faith for yourself and also around lots of Catholic people and having opportunities to talk and to pray and be part of the practices of Catholic faith. What was it like then going to work where I presume you were meeting people who were not from a Catholic background, perhaps for the first time?
Well, can I actually talk about university before work? Because I think that's probably quite helpful in a way. Of course, it's there that I really came across people from a non-Catholic background for the first time. I went to university and, went to the Catholic chaplaincy, became part of that. There was a process of maturity, I think, at university in terms of faith. And I remember when I first went there being very open-minded. In the first week, you come across the Christian Union, probably in any university, evangelical Protestant Christian Union, pretty hard line, pretty anti-Catholic actually, but quite strong, forceful. And so I thought, well, I must sort of be friends with everybody and everybody is sort of on the same page, must be nice to everyone, and went to a few of their things, I suppose, and wondered what I thought about it. Yeah, I think I was feeling a bit unsure about the proper relationship between being Catholic and other Christian denominations. I think my faith really for adulthood was shaped by two particular sermons given at the Catholic chaplaincy by the then chaplain, Father Christopher Jenkins. And he gave one sermon about the Christian Union, and he pointed out very forcefully and almost polemically the difference between being Catholic and being, let's say, an evangelical Christian. He was fed up, frankly, I think, with Catholic students coming to him and saying, "Oh, Mass is a bit boring. I like going to the Christian Union where we have a lot of singing and, Alleluia, and that's where I find my faith." And he said, no, a lot of non-Catholic beliefs are simply not true. And even the most poorly educated Catholic student knows whole depths of theology that others don't. Don't be ashamed of being Catholic. Be proud of being Catholic. It was an extraordinary sermon. I've never heard anything like it before or since. But it was a forthright affirmation that it matters being Catholic. Not all churches are the same. Not all Christian denominations believe the same thing. And, the church teaches with the authority of the apostles and all the rest of it. So that's really the first time I'd ever heard that. And it had a big effect on me. And the second sermon was somewhat similar. It was particularly about intercommunion, receiving communion between Catholics and Anglicans. As people were encouraged to do at college chapels, they always say everyone welcome to communion, Catholics can come. And he was explaining why Catholics ought not to join in communion with Anglican fellows, because although it's nice and it seems friendly and neat in a way, when you really think about what the Eucharist is, you're symbolizing something which is not true. You're symbolizing a unity. By receiving communion together, you're symbolizing and taking an action based on a reality that's not there. It's a bit of theatre. So real ecumenism is, he said, John Paul II and the Archbishop of Canterbury, when John Paul came to the UK, about that time actually, they did a lot of things together and a prayer service together, but they did not receive communion together. And the real work of ecumenism was slogging it out on the table with theologians at the what was then called ARCIC, Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, to debate and resolve, insofar as it were possible, issues about the Eucharist, authority in the church, and so on. So I think those two sermons, and they were printed, and I have copies of them, still quite important to me, and I can still quote great chunks of them as I've just done.
That is really interesting, Nigel, because both of those things, some guests have spoken in the same kind of way, certainly about finding truth in the Catholic Church over other churches. But some guests have also been in a different place on the ecumenism area that you're talking about. There's something there for listeners to really think about and see what resonates. And I'm going to think about that too. I think that's very sound. That sermon that you heard all those years ago that is still, through us talking today, still reaching people and giving people something to think about. That's really helpful. Thank you. I think there's something about your university experience then that has really affirmed you in your faith before you go out into the really big wide world of work then. So what was that like?
Well, that was fine. I went from university to bar school in London and did bar exams and then qualified as a barrister. But then pretty early on, joined the Foreign Office as a legal advisor. So that's the diplomatic service, working for the government as a legal advisor. I was, very much interested in human rights and was involved in Amnesty International at university and in my first years in London. I was chair of the lawyers group, I think, in 1987. Although very young, I had more time than others. And of course, when you think about human rights, you don't really think about working for governments. Governments are normally the enemy.
The bad guys.
Yeah, they're the bad guys. Nevertheless, I wanted to do international law, public international law, that is the law of states, United Nations, treaties, law of the sea, all that kind of international scene was the kind of law I wanted to do.
I've got two questions already. One is about, what your faith brought to that, values that you'd grown up with and things. But I also want to just think about in this time when there are so many conflicts around the world. I mean, we think there are more than before, but who knows? I'm wondering what insights you might have into the role governments can play in resolving those or preventing them happening. I don't know. But can we start with, as a Catholic person then, affirmed in your faith going into the world of international human rights? How did that look? Was it something you talked about at work?
Yes, to some extent, I think. And I guess it's actually quite obvious, isn't it, the connection when you think about it? Almost who is against human rights? But I think in the 70s, it was still relatively new. Amnesty was very relatively new. There's obviously a connection between ideas of human rights and ideas of justice. And so for people with a bent towards thinking about justice and ethics, then human rights has an obvious appeal. It retains that appeal, perhaps even more so now. And I think international law has some of the same attraction. Some law can be fairly technical, I suppose, whereas international law is extremely ambitious in its scope. It's trying to get nations to behave in certain ways when, of course, nations are sovereign, unless they're bound by a treaty, are often not bound to do particular things, just as they're not bound to appear before international courts unless they consent. International law aims to regulate relations between states, and that's quite everyday things like postal services, let's say, or airline services. But of course, it also ultimately is about the biggest issues, the use of force, with the way states, about going to war in the first place. And if you do go to war, then regulating conduct in warfare, in humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and so on. It also regulates, law of the sea and even outer space. So it's a very wide-ranging and ambitious type of law, and I think it does attract a certain. I won't say everybody's an idealist, but I think there's something about that when you start to study it. For me, at least, as I learned about it and could have related it, I suppose, to my own idea of justice. And on the whole, international law makes sense as a matter of justice. Of course, the difficulty is getting states to comply with it. And that's your second point, I think. And of course, well, that's what I dedicated 27 years of my life to, is advising the British government. I think one of my colleagues once said that, our job was to uphold the sanctity of treaties. That's a rather elaborated way of saying it, but in a sense it's true, trying to advise on what the law is and by all possible means try and ensure that the government accepts that advice and acts accordingly. And in the British context, at least in my time there, that was not too difficult a job. I think the culture was very much a law-abiding culture. The idea that you must consult the legal advisors and don't do it unless you check with the legal advisor was quite ingrained in the culture. And there are very few occasions, I think, when there was a real clash of giving advice and it being rejected. Though that's not the case in every country. I wouldn't fancy being Putin's legal advisor, and I certainly wouldn't fancy being Donald Trump's legal advisor. I suspect Trump has a very limited respect for international law, let's put it that way. If a head of state really is very happy to ride roughshod over international obligations, that's that's a very difficult situation. At least we don't expect it from the US.
Given that, Nigel, how do you feel as a person living in these times, seeing the potential for international law being eroded in ways that it wasn't before? Do you feel afraid or irritated, angry?
I think I feel some concern. I think I just add a little bit of qualification that international law doesn't always get things right. And there are sometimes situations where applying the letter of the law might lead to an unjust result. So I think there is still an underlying idea of justice. One hopes that the two principles of law and the principles of justice coincide. So just to give you an example, which I was thinking about yesterday, apparently there are 9 or 10,000 Islamic State fighters being detained, I think in northern Syria, if I've got that right. Say, what will happen to those fighters? Well, of course, in terms of international law, human rights law, well, either they're prisoners of war and should be released at the end of the conflict, or they're criminals and they should be tried and duly charged. Well, with 9 or 10,000 IS fighters, you're not going to have 10,000 criminal trials at the Old Bailey. So does international law say you should let them go? And off they go on their merry way to who knows what. So I'm not saying there's always a neat answer, and sometimes there may be a rather awkward connection between doing what seems sensible and obviously right and the letter of the law. So that's a slight qualification. Generally, international law is a sensible framework that tries to, have states relating to each other in a regulated way rather than simply this law of the jungle, the strongest prevailing over the weakest.
Okay, rather than all of us are children of God and, we all have human dignity and those kind of principles that I suppose the Catholic Church would uphold. I'm struggling to put into words those values in a way that just highlights how the values of our faith would accord with international law that's being done well.
Yes, and of course, in terms of human rights, there's a religious underpinning for many people in the concept of human rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, whilst it was agreed by a whole bunch of states, it has certain philosophical underpinnings and religious underpinnings. That's really why a lot of people believe in human rights, because they think it's actually an articulation of their faith in a secular document. So yes, those ideas of human dignity is at the heart of the concept of human rights, and fairness and equity, I guess, are the underpinnings of international law on the whole, at least in the modern system.
And maybe this brings us on a little bit to your work with the Catholic Union. Tell us a bit about what that looked like.
After 27 years at the Foreign Office, I left 2015. And then after a while, I started volunteering with this organisation called the Catholic Union of Great Britain. I'd been a member of it before, and it's basically lay Catholics engaged in politics and public life. I always felt when I was working at the Foreign Office and going to meetings that perhaps I could help, so I became a volunteer. And that really evolved into discussion about having a professional post in the Catholic Union. It was otherwise largely run by volunteers. And so a job evolved, if you like, which I was invited to fill. And I became director in 2017 and continued for 7 years until April last year. I mean, our work is things like making submissions to government and to parliament, lobbying, advocating the Catholic viewpoint on issues of the day, legislation or policy, and also education, having lectures and webinars, working with other Catholic organisations to promote the Catholic viewpoint, giving lay Catholics an opportunity, I guess, to feed in to the political life of the country, taking part in public affairs, whether by standing for election themselves or by writing to their MPs or taking part in the debate in the public square.
That's really helpful. It looks to me, in our current times, there are more and more things where our viewpoint as Catholics seems to be, a gap is widening somehow between our view as Catholics and some things that are now happening in public life. I don't know quite how to word that better. Is that what it seems like to you, or is it just it's always been like that?
We can take the obvious headline issues, life issues. The picture there is not very rosy. Obviously, we've got the debate on assisted dying at the moment. We don't know how that's going to come out, but it was unfortunate that the first vote was lost. So yes, in many ways, one can trace a development that moves away from Catholic positions on the sanctity of life. I suppose one can pick and choose a little bit. Insofar as the death penalty is part of the Catholic position on the sanctity of life, then the movement's in the other direction. Most states in the world, or many states now, do not impose the death penalty, and some regard it as a matter of human rights as well. So it's not entirely one way. And of course, there's many other issues apart from the life issues, stemming from Catholic social teaching about the nature of society and care for the poor and vulnerable and so on, which I guess in many ways the underlying assumptions are similar to those of Catholic social teaching about there being a need to protect the poor and vulnerable and so on, even if the exact policy details about how you do that and what you can afford to do is a matter of debate.
And I'm also thinking while you're talking, actually, that in some ways the church is evolving too and moving itself on. I'm thinking of LGBT issues, for example, where on the one hand there is a gap, but on the other hand, the church is not fixed on where it is in that debate. That's what I think anyway. I think the church is moving there. It's a bit simplistic, isn't it, to think that this is pillar A is where the church is and pillar B where society is keeps moving. Actually, we're all moving, aren't we, I suppose, over time.
I think there's a number of movements which are not all in the same direction. The other thing people talk about a lot is the increasing, secular nature of society and the world. I'm not sure if that's entirely right, actually. It's a very easy thing to agree with. If someone says our society becomes so secular, and yes, there's many ways in which you can see that. But on the other hand, there's certainly a lot of people looking at it at a global level. I think the faith is actually increasing in terms of numbers globally. it is a bit disappointing if society consciously divests itself of its Christian framework. I hate the idea of crucifixes being taken down in certain places. And, well, I just say this, that there's a great difference between a Catholic church and a non-denominational prayer room in an airport. Community prayer was basically a plain room with a cupboard with a Bible and a Quran and a mat and so on. For some, that's a sort of ideal, then that's a sort of vision of a secular society. Then I don't find that a very attractive vision. But it's true, we don't have the same level of general acceptance of Christianity that there was, I guess, years ago. Yeah, I suppose I just dwell more on the positives, not dwell too much on the negatives, and do what we can to maintain what we've got and keep reinserting Christianity into the public debate and in the public square. I talk to people and point out churches or the saints or references to sometimes specifically the Catholic heritage of our country. Very happy to tell people, in case they don't know already, about the 1,000 years that England was a Catholic country before the Reformation.
It is important to recognise that, rather than feeling negative, actually, we can still go to Mass. I'm here doing a podcast and reaching Catholic people so that we can be a community, continuing to grow and share our story. I just wanted to talk about the Jubilee a little bit, talking about feeling positive, brings us on to hope and the year ahead. I've talked a little bit with guests about this Jubilee and the theme Pilgrims of Hope, and I'm wondering, how are you interacting with this Jubilee year?
In a very practical sense, I'm planning to go to Rome in October, I think. If all goes to plan, I will be doing the Jubilee activities of going through the holy doors. I will follow whatever other activities are available as well.
And I know there's something around the Jubilee, there's the theme Pilgrims of Hope. I've talked with some guests about what gives us hope. But there's also this ancient Jubilee reset of justice, isn't there? I wonder whether that speaks to you a little bit. Is there some way in which you can see we may be able to reset something for justice in I don't know, internationally is perhaps a big claim, but in Britain?
What comes to mind is the idea of the Jubilee debt campaign, I think from the year 2000, which I think is being, talked about again. That seems to be the most practical way of actually taking some action. As for more generally, well, I think that's very difficult, really. But in specific instances, I don't know if there's any particular ideas that would be in any sense a reset. I mean, there's going to be a public inquiry now about the recent murders in Southport. In a sense, if that results in a change in the law, that could be an element of justice. I think about the post office scandal, very tangible example of injustice. But I just wanted to say something which just occurred to me, that I am also going, it's not exactly a Jubilee event, I don't think, but I'm going on a pilgrimage to Turkey in May, which does mark a different anniversary. It's the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea, 325, and the Nicene Creed, which we all recite every week at Mass. So I'm going to Turkey and we'll visit Nicaea, which I think is now called Iznik. The pilgrimage is called the Seven Churches of Asia, the first seven councils of the Church. So we visit Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, Nicaea as it then was, and we'll be learning about those early meetings of the Church where they really decided Christian doctrine, the Catholic faith that we have today.
That sounds really interesting. Wow.
Yeah.
What a great opportunity. Yeah.
We'll be hearing more about that 1700th anniversary. I've been trying to think if there's a word for the 1700th anniversary. I've come up with decaheptacentenary.
We'll see if that catches on. I'll try that as a hashtag when I'm advertising the episode. Listen, it's been really good to talk, Nigel. You've got some really great insights there that I think people will appreciate having a chance to hear from you. So thank you for sharing so much about your life and your thoughts in these current times. I'll put some links in the episode notes to some of the organisations that you've mentioned. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been really interesting to talk, Nigel.
Thank you, Trace. I've enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining me on All Kinds of Catholic this time. I hope today's conversation has resonated with you. A new episode is released each Wednesday. Follow All Kinds of Catholic on the usual podcast platforms. Rate and review to help others find it. And follow our X, Twitter and Facebook accounts @Kinds of Catholic. You can comment on episodes and be part of the dialogue there. You can also text me if you're listening to the podcast on your phone, although I won't be able to reply to those texts. Until the next time then.